ब्रह्मनाथ ओ शांति 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 स्वस्थ। Hello students, in the previous class we discussed the last, we can say the class, that is your mammalia. In the class mammalia we discussed that the mammals are generally found in every place of the earth, such as they are also the aquatic, they are also terrestrial, there may be arboreal, and also we can say that they are found on the every place of the earth. Mostly they are found on the every place of the earth. Next we discussed that in the class mammalia they have generally the oil glands or the sebaceous glands. The body is covered by we can say the hairs. Exoskeleton, we can say the horny scales, hoof, nails, etc. we discussed. In the case of the mammalia, we discussed that the parental care is at its maximum. Okay, and also in the mammalia we discussed that the brain is well developed. In the case of the cerebral hemisphere are being attached or joined by the convoluted corpus callosum, and the type of the kidney that is found is the most developed type of kidney, that is your metanephric kidney is found. Next, generally the respiration is basically done by the help of the lungs. That is why the type of respiration is generally the pulmonary respiration. Okay, so like this we discussed so many points under the class mammalia. Okay, by which we came to the end of the complete animal kingdom. Okay students, today we will start our complete new portion or topic, that is your breathing and respiration. Okay, that is your breathing and respiration. First point students, there are various vital processes that are being carried out in our body. Simply, there are also digestion present, excretion, respiration, circulation. Okay, and respiration is one of the important vital processes that takes place inside our body. So your first point we can write, student, the introduction portion, first point. Inside the animal's body, there are various vital processes that are going on, such as your digestion, respiration, excretion, circulation, etc. So your first point, inside the animal's body, various vital processes are going on. Common example, as I said, digestion, excretion, respiration, circulation, excretion, respiration, circulation, etc. Circulation, etc. Or we can say various vital physiological process. It will be better you write, students, various vital physiological process. Vital physiological process. Okay. Okay students, inside the animal's body, various vital physiological processes, or we can say various physiological process are going on. Common example are digestion, excretion, respiration, circulation. So simply today our topic is, we can say, the respiration. So the respiration is one of the important vital physiological process that is carrying inside the body, or we can say that is carrying, or we can say that is going on inside our body. So we can write respiration is one of the vital physiological process that is carried out in our body, that is carried out inside the animal's body. Okay, now come to your proper definition. Students, what do you mean by respiration? Simply, students, see, after the digestion, when the food molecules are being we can say digested or break down into the simpler forms, okay, and by the help of the respiration, the food gets oxidized. How? Simply we take in oxygen, okay, simply we take in oxygen. By the help of when the oxygen is we can say exposed to the food, or we can say food is simply exposed to the oxygen, then the oxidation of the food takes place. Then what happens? Then the energy is being released, which is useful for various vital functions. Then the carbon dioxide and water is also produced as a byproduct. Okay, students. So we can write simply the definition. In the respiration, it is a series of chemical reaction where the food is being oxidized to give the energy. Simple and clear definition, students. Respiration is a series of chemical reaction where food is oxidized to give the energy. Always remember, students, for the oxidation of the food, oxygen is highly required. That is why it is called the oxidation. Means what? Whenever the food is being exposed to the oxidation takes place. So it is important that for the oxidation, the oxygen is highly essential. So we can write our the next point, that is the oxygen is required for the oxidation of food. Okay. Last point, student. After the oxidation of food, what are the various byproducts that we get? Basically, the byproducts are carbon dioxide, water, and obviously energy is released in the form of the ATP. Always remember. Okay. So byproducts are we can say the carbon dioxide or CO2, then the water. Okay, I am writing the formula CO2, this one is your H2O. Okay, and obviously you know the energy. Okay, and energy which is released in the form of the ATP. Always remember, the energy is always released in the form of the ATP. Okay, so the byproducts are carbon dioxide, water, and the energy. If we will come to the equation, students, see how we can write. The simple equation is C6H12O6. This is simply the glucose. Okay, C6H12O6. This is simply the glucose. This has been exposed to the oxygen, or we can say simply oxidized to form the CO2 plus H2O, and energy is being released. Okay, to balance the equation, we should put 1 6 here, 1 6 here, 1 6 here. Always you should remember that you should write the balanced equation. Okay, so the equation is This is the simpler food molecule, that is we can say the glucose. Whenever it is oxidized or exposed to the oxygen, we get the byproduct as the CO2 and H2O, and the energy is being released in the form of the ATP. So this is all about the introduction of the respiration. What do you mean by breathing? What do you mean by the breathing? It is a process in which the oxygen is being received and the carbon dioxide is being eliminated. So we can write our next point, that is the breathing. It is the process in which the oxygen is being received and carbon dioxide is being eliminated. It is the process in which oxygen is received and carbon dioxide is eliminated. Okay, always remember that the breathing is the first step of the respiration. The breathing is the first step of respiration. So students, your question will arise that what is the breathing, what is respiration? Always remember, respiration means, students, it is the various chemical changes. Okay, means glucose is present, or we can say the simpler form of the food molecule is present. Whenever oxygen gets exposed to the food molecule, it gets oxidized to form the CO2, to form the water, and the major function to produce the energy by which we does the various vital functions. So this chemical reaction is respiration. This is not breathing. The physical activity that we do means we take in oxygen, we eliminate carbon dioxide. This physical activity, this is known as breathing. Respiration is not, we can say that we can simply say the intake of the oxygen and the elimination of the carbon dioxide. We cannot say that, because that is the case of the breathing. Respiration means whenever we take the oxygen, what the oxygen does, or the changes that the oxygen takes place inside our body, that is respiration. That is not breathing. You should not confuse. Okay, so breathing means it is simply the physical process, or we can say the physical activity by which we directly, we can say, receive the oxygen and eliminate the carbon dioxide. Simply that is known as your breathing. And obviously respiration, how it starts? Obviously whenever we will take the oxygen, then only the respiration will start. No, if the oxygen will come into inside our body, then only the glucose molecule will be, we can say, oxidized. No. So we can say now, students, that the breathing is the first step of the respiration. Okay, so we can say that the breathing is the first step of the respiration. So till now what we discussed? First the introduction, inside the animal's body, various vital activities that are going on, such as your digestion, respiration, excretion, circulation, etc., etc. Next, the respiration is one of the important vital activity or the process that is carried out inside our body. And the definition, respiration is simply, we can say, it is the series of the chemical reaction where the food is oxidized to give the energy. Remember, energy in the form of the ATP. Oxygen is highly required for the oxidation of the food. Various byproducts are carbon dioxide, water, and obviously the energy will be released. C6H12O6 plus 6CO2 will give rise to 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus energy in the form of the ATP. What is breathing? As I said, it is the process in which the oxygen is being received and carbon dioxide is being eliminated. Eliminated we can write from the body. Eliminated from the body. And obviously, as I said, breathing is the first step of the respiration. Okay, please note down. Next point, student, we will discuss the difference between the respiration and breathing. We discussed now what is respiration, we discussed now what is the breathing. So let's discuss the difference between the respiration and the breathing. So students, you only tell me what is the respiration, what is the breathing. Yes, respiration, it is a biochemical process, whereas the breathing, it is a physical process. Okay, your first point, it is a biochemical process. Why biochemical process, students? Because series of chemical reaction takes place. It is a biochemical process, whereas it is a physical process. It is a physical process because the physical activity occurs during this, means the energy is being used by which we take the oxygen and eliminate the carbon dioxide. It is a physical process. Now you tell students, in the respiration we discussed that the energy is being released, but as it is a physical activity, suppose anything, for doing any physical activity, suppose I am lifting this water bottle, there might be required less energy, but yes, the energy is being required, means we can say the energy being required to do the physical activity. So we can write, in this case, in the case of respiration, the energy is being released, but in the breathing, the energy is required. Okay, so we can write, in this, energy is released, but in the case of the breathing, the energy is required. The energy is required. Okay, next point, where does the respiration occurs? The respiration occurs in all cells of the body, whereas the breathing occurs in some special organs of the body. See, breathing, how it does, the various, we can say, respiratory organs are there. The lungs is there, we can see the windpipe, the trachea, or we can see the air goes through the nasal cavity or the nose. So various organs are there which are included inside the breathing. So we can write, it occurs in, we can say, it occurs in the some special organs of the body. Okay, but in the case of the respiration, it occurs in almost all cells of the body. So we can write, it occurs in almost all cells. Okay, but breathing occurs in some specialized organs or some special organs of the body, some cells of almost all cells of the body, whereas the breathing, it occurs in some special organs of the body. Okay, next point, as the respiration occurs inside the cell, or we can say in almost all the cells of the body, we can say that the respiration, it is an intracellular process, because the respiration takes place inside the body, or inside the cell, whereas in the case of the breathing, it is the extracellular process, because the breathing takes place outside the cell. So we can write, it is an intracellular process where it takes place inside the cell. Intracellular means inside the cell, whereas it is an extracellular process. It is an extracellular process. Extracellular process where it takes place, or we can say it is an extracellular process which takes place, simply we can write which takes place outside the cell. outside the cell. Okay, suppose you how we can say outside the cell. See, suppose students, we can say this is the windpipe and these are the various cells are present. Okay, these are various cells are present. So by the help of the windpipe, the oxygen comes in and CO2 comes out. So you can see that the breathing takes place outside the cell, that is why it is called the extracellular. But in the case of the respiration, each and every cell that have the, we can say, the glucose molecule, it is exposed to the oxygen molecule, by which the food gets oxidized to liberate the, we can say, CO2, H2O as the byproduct, and the energy is being released. So we can say that the breathing is an extracellular process which takes place outside the cell, and the respiration, it is an intercellular process which takes place inside the cell. Okay, and last point, as the respiration is a series of chemical reaction, obviously the enzymes are being used in the case of the respiration. As the breathing is a physical process, enzymes are not used. So we can write our last point, enzymes are used in the case of the respiration, whereas I am erasing it, whereas enzymes are not used, enzymes are not used, are not used, simply enzymes are not used in the case of the breathing. So point, let's discuss once again. Respiration, it is a biochemical process, breathing, it is a physical process. In this, the respiration, the energy is released. In the breathing, the energy is required as it is a physical activity. Respiration occurs in almost all cells of the body, and the breathing, it occurs in some special organs of the body. Respiration, it is an intercellular process which takes place inside the cell, whereas the breathing, it is an extracellular process which takes place outside the cell. Okay, in the respiration, enzymes are simply used, and also in the breathing, the enzymes are not used. Okay, so this is the difference between the respiration and the breathing. Okay, please note down. Students, you can change here, it occurs in almost, not we can write, it will be more appropriate, it will, if you write, it occurs in all cells of the body. Okay, you write, it occurs in all cells of the body. Okay, it will be more appropriate. Please change it. Next point, students, what are the various kinds of the respiration on the availability of the oxygen? As we discussed that the respiration means, we can say simply the series of the chemical reactions. Okay, simply. So students, if the oxygen is present, then the type of respiration, you can tell that is the type of respiration is aerobic respiration. If oxygen is not used, then you can say that the type of respiration is anaerobic respiration. Okay, so that is why we have written the kinds of respiration that is based on the availability of oxygen. It is of two types. One is your aerobic respiration, other one is your anaerobic respiration. Students, aerobic respiration is further divided into direct aerobic respiration and indirect aerobic respiration. This is also further divided into direct aerobic respiration and indirect aerobic respiration. Direct aerobic respiration means, students, the exchange of the gas takes place in between the cells and the environment. Direct, as it occurs inside the, or we can say in the lower organisms. Okay, but in the case means in that no special organs are being involved. But in the case of the indirect aerobic respiration, the exchange takes place by the help of the various special organs, such as we can say the the skin, the lungs, the gills, etc. So for this is first for just your extra knowledge, that the direct, you can write, the exchange takes place between the cell and the environment. Direct, between the cell and the environment. Okay, as in the case of the lower organisms. Example, you can take the lower organisms. Okay, indirect means what? Exchange takes place by the help of, we can say, some special organs. Exchange takes place by the help of, or we can say by the special organs. Okay, example, you can take simply skin, lungs, then the gills, okay, etc. Okay, this is for just your extra knowledge. Okay, direct means from in the lower organism, from the cell direct into the environment, the exchange of the gases takes place. Okay, but in the case of if we will take in our case, in the human being or any mammal or any higher organisms, in that case special organs are there for the respiration, such as it may be the lungs, it may be the gills, or it may be the skins. Okay, so this is all about your aerobic types respiration, direct or indirect. Okay, then if you will go to the aerobic respiration, first point, as I told you, oxygen is used, then the type of respiration is your, we can say, the aerobic respiration. So the first point we can write, the oxygen is used, okay, in the type of aerobic respiration by which the food is completely oxidized. Okay, the food is completely oxidized. So your first point we can write, the oxygen is used for the oxidation of food. In the case of the aerobic respiration, the oxygen is used for the oxidation of the food. What are the various byproducts that we find in the case of the aerobic respiration? Yes, the CO2, H2O. Okay, basically the CO2 means carbon dioxide. I am not writing another time. CO2 and the H2O is released as the byproduct, or we can say CO2 and H2O are simply the byproduct. Okay, next point. In the case of the aerobic respiration, the food which is being oxidized or the food which is exposed to the oxygen is being completely oxidized. Okay, or we can say the complete breakdown of the food takes place. So we can write our next point, that the food in the case of the aerobic respiration is completely oxidized. So we can write, the food is being completely oxidized. The food is completely oxidized. Okay, next point, the equation, common equation, you know, I will write once more time, C6H12O6. Here oxygen is used, so that is why we are writing O2. What we will find is the byproduct, CO2 plus H2O plus energy in the form of the ATP. Always remember, okay, to balance the equation, 6O2, 6 CO2, 6 H2O. Okay. Okay, so what is the equation? The equation is, we can say that C6H12O6, which is your glucose molecule, when it is oxidized, the byproduct will CO2 and H2O, and obviously the energy is being released, or the ATP. Students, now question arises that from one glucose molecule, how many number of ATP is being, or we can say, released? Yes, or we can say evolved. So our answer is, in the case of the aerobic respiration, 38 ATP molecules are evolved from one molecule of the glucose. Okay, always remember, important point, 38 ATP molecules are evolved from one molecule of glucose. Okay. Then the next last point, as we discussed that the breakdown of the food takes place or the glucose takes place, so that is why various important processes are also carrying out, such as your, we can say, the glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. Simply remember students, in the case of the aerobic respiration, the glycolysis takes place inside the cytoplasm, and the Krebs cycle that takes place inside the mitochondria, which is the main powerhouse of the cell, which the main function of the mitochondria to produce the energy. So we can write our next point. The glycolysis always takes place inside the cytoplasm, and the Krebs cycle always takes place inside the mitochondria, or we can say it is the powerhouse of the cell. Students, detail about the glycolysis and Krebs cycle you will read in the botany chapter, so don't worry about that. Okay, so the various points we discussed, that the aerobic, if the oxygen is present, then it is the respiration type is known as your aerobic respiration. If oxygen is absent, then it is your anaerobic respiration. Aerobic is of two types, direct, indirect. If the exchange takes place in between directly the cell and the environment in the lower organism, it is your direct aerobic respiration. If some special organs are being involved, then it is known as your indirect aerobic respiration, such as your organs such as your skin, lungs, gills, etc. Next, come to the aerobic respiration. Obviously, oxygen is used for the oxidation of the food. CO2 and H2O is released as the byproduct. Food is completely oxidized. Okay, complete breakdown of the food takes place. If we will go to the equation, C6H12O6 plus CO2 will give rise to CO2 and H2 as the byproduct, and the energy is being released as the ATP molecule. How many number of ATP molecules are being released? 38 ATP molecules are being released from one glucose molecule. Okay, this is one glucose molecule. So, and the glycolysis simply takes place inside the cytoplasm, and the Krebs cycle simply takes place inside the mitochondria. Okay, please note down. Now students, come to your next type of respiration, that is your, we can say, the anaerobic respiration. Simply opposite, if the oxygen is not used, then it is known as your, we can say, anaerobic respiration. So we can write our next first point. The oxygen is not used. The oxygen is not used. The oxygen is not used. Okay, and in this student, as we have told, in the aerobic respiration the food is completely oxidized, but in the case of the anaerobic respiration the food is not completely breakdown takes place, or we can say the food is, means in the case of the anaerobic respiration the incomplete breakdown of the food takes place. So we can write our next point, incomplete breakdown of the food takes place. Okay, students, anaerobic respiration is also known as your fermentation process. It is also known as fermentation. Okay, what we will say, it is also known as the fermentation. Okay, always remember, anaerobic respiration means simply we can tell that the oxygen is being not used. Incomplete breakdown of the food takes place, and it is also known as the fermentation. Okay, example, it takes place inside the, we can say, the yeast, the bacteria. Okay, some parasites such as your Ascaris tenia. Okay, common example we can take, such as your the yeast, okay, bacteria, then the various parasites such as your Ascaris tenia, Ascaris tenia. Right? Okay. Next, in the higher vertebrate also, the anaerobic respiration takes place inside the muscle tissue and also the RBC. Why RBC? Because in the RBC no mitochondria is present. As no mitochondria is present, obviously no generation of the energy, or we can say it is the main powerhouse of the cell. Okay, so simply we can tell that in the case of the higher vertebrate also, means in our case also, anaerobic respiration takes place in some cell, or we can say some area. You remember, sometimes while we doing the heavy exercise or vigorous exercise, our muscle cramps occur. Why? Due to the deficiency of the oxygen, due to the unavailability of the oxygen. Yes, that is exactly known as your anaerobic respiration. So we can write also the next point. In higher vertebrates, anaerobic respiration occurs inside the muscle tissue and RBC. Okay. Next, the various byproduct, or we can say what are the various byproducts that we find. In the case of the anaerobic respiration, the byproduct, it may be the alcohol or it may be the acid. In alcohol, it is generally the ethyl alcohol, and in the case of the acid, it is basically the lactic acid. Okay, so we can write as the byproduct, it is basically the alcohol or acid. If alcohol, then basically it is the ethyl alcohol. If acid is being released as the byproduct, then answer will be lactic acid. Okay, byproduct, it may be alcohol or it may be acid. If it is alcohol, then the answer will be all ethyl alcohol. If it is acid, then your answer will be lactic acid. Okay, next point. The anaerobic respiration is further divided into two type of, we can say it is divided into two types of fermentation process. If the alcohol is released as the byproduct, then the type of fermentation, as we know, the anaerobic respiration, it is also known as fermentation. Then if the alcohol is being released as the byproduct, then it is known as your alcoholic fermentation, and in this CO2 is being released. If lactic acid is being released, then it is known as, we can say, the acidic fermentation. So simply, students, I am writing here only the fermentation process. It is also known as the fermentation process. It is also of two types. We can say the alcoholic. Always remember, it is divided on the basic on the end product. So it will better, I will write on the lower portion. Based on the end product, it will be much better one. It is of two types. One is we can say alcoholic fermentation. Other one is your acidic fermentation. Okay. Remember, in the alcoholic fermentation, the end product is ethyl alcohol. Here the end product is lactic acid. Remember, in this the CO2 is released. Okay, if you will go by the equation, you will find such is we can say the CO2 is released. But in the case of the lactic acid, the CO2 is not being released. Okay, so in the case of the ethyl alcohol, CO2 is released. But in the case of the lactic acid, CO2 is not released. Okay. So the alcoholic fermentation is generally used for the production of the alcohol, whereas The acidic fermentation is basically used in the case of the, we can say, lactic acid is formed in the case of the muscle tissue or the muscle cramp, and also in the lactobacillus also. Okay, so this is for your extra knowledge. Okay, the fermentation process is divided into two types: the alcoholic fermentation and the acidic fermentation. If alcohol is produced as the end product, then it is known as alcoholic fermentation. If acid is produced as the byproduct or the end product, then it is known as the acidic fermentation. Just simple thing. Okay, in the alcohol, it is basically the end product is ethyl alcohol, and in the acidic fermentation, the end product is basically lactic acid. In the case of the ethyl alcohol, the CO2 will release. Okay, and also energy obviously will release, but in the case of the acidic fermentation, CO2 will not released. Okay, so these are your some general points. In the anaerobic respiration, the oxygen is not used. Incomplete breakdown of the food takes place. It is also known as your fermentation. It occurs in the case of example yeast, bacteria, parasites such as your Ascaris, Taenia. In higher vertebrates, in our case also anaerobic respiration takes place, such as your muscle cramp takes place, where the inavailability of the oxygen takes place, and also in the case of the RBC. Okay, byproducts can be alcohol or can be acid. Okay, ethyl alcohol or lactic acid. Okay, based on the end product, if ethyl alcohol is being produced, then it is known as your alcoholic fermentation. If lactic acid is produced, then it is known as your acidic fermentation. Okay, please note down. Lastly, students, we will come to the difference between the anaerobic respiration and the aerobic respiration. Simply, students, we discussed all the points. Let's discuss the difference between. In the anaerobic respiration, the oxygen is not used, and in the aerobic respiration, the oxygen is used. So, your first point, in this, the oxygen is not used. Okay, but in the case of the aerobic respiration, the oxygen is used. The oxygen is used. That is why it is known as aerobic respiration. Oxygen is used. Okay, next point. The byproducts may be CO2 or may not be, but in the case of the anaerobic respiration. But in the case of the aerobic respiration, the CO2 is the must as the byproduct. So we can write byproduct may be CO2 or not, but in the case of the aerobic respiration, the byproducts must be CO2. Okay, students, in the case of the anaerobic respiration, the food is incompletely breakdown, or we can say the incomplete breakdown of the food takes place in case of the anaerobic respiration. Okay, but in the case of the aerobic respiration, the food is completely oxidized, or we can say breakdown of the complete food takes place, or we can say complete breakdown of the food takes place. In the case of the anaerobic respiration, incomplete breakdown of the food takes place. Okay, we discussed, but in the case of the aerobic respiration, the complete breakdown of the food takes place. The complete breakdown of the food takes place. Okay, next. In the case of the anaerobic respiration, it occurs inside the inside the we can say the cytoplasm only. But in the case of the aerobic respiration, it occurs in both cytoplasm and mitochondria. It occurs inside the cytoplasm only. Okay, but in the case of the aerobic respiration, it occurs both in cytoplasm and mitochondria. It occurs in both cytoplasm and mitochondria. Okay, students, next. How many ATP molecules are released in the anaerobic respiration? Yes, 2 ATP molecules. But in the case of the aerobic respiration, 38 ATP molecules are being evolved. We can write 2 ATP molecules are evolved, which is we can say less energy, or we can say the less energy. But in the case of the aerobic respiration, 38 ATP molecules, 38 ATP molecules are evolved, okay, which is generally we can say more energy, okay. Lastly, where the anaerobic respiration takes place, basically in the yeast, the muscle tissue, okay, the RBC, where the anaerobic respiration takes place. And in the case of aerobic respiration, in most cases of the plants and animals. Common example, human being. We can take place example in the yeast, then the muscle tissue, okay, etc. And in this case, most plants and animals. Example is most plants and animals. Most plants and animals. In the examples of animals, you can write in our case humans. Okay. So these are your some general points. First point, anaerobic means oxygen. N means oxygen is not there. Oxygen is not used. Aerobic, oxygen is used. In anaerobic, byproduct may be CO2 or not. But in the aerobic, the byproduct should be CO2. In the anaerobic, incomplete breakdown of the food takes place. But in the aerobic, complete breakdown of the food takes place. In the anaerobic, it occurs inside the cytoplasm only. But in the aerobic respiration, it occurs in both cytoplasm and mitochondria. In aerobic, 2 ATP molecules are evolved, which is called less energy. In the aerobic respiration, 38 ATP molecules are evolved, which is we can say more energy is being produced or released. Simply we can say released, it will be much more point. 2 ATP molecules are released. Okay. So students, today we discussed complete the introduction portion of the respiration and breathing. First we discussed that in our body various vital activities are there, such as your digestion, excretion, respiration, then the circulation, and respiration is one of them. Respiration is we can say it is a series of chemical reaction in which the oxidation of the food takes place, whereas the breathing is the physical activity in which the oxygen is being received and carbon dioxide is being eliminated. Further we discussed that in the respiration it is of two types, where one is your aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration is also further divided into direct and indirect, whereas the anaerobic respiration is divided into, we can say, on the base of the end product, it is divided into alcoholic fermentation and the acidic fermentation. And also lastly we discussed the difference between the anaerobic respiration and aerobic respiration. The common point, the most important point is if oxygen is present, then it is your aerobic respiration. If oxygen is absent, simply it is your anaerobic respiration. So simply we discussed so many difference between the anaerobic respiration and the aerobic respiration. Okay. So that's all for today. We will meet in our next class. Thank you.